Do you need to right-size your clinic space? Maybe your clinic location didn't turn out to be as good as you expected. Maybe you couldn't recruit those extra physicians or healthcare providers that you had planned. Or maybe your revenue forecasts are not as good as expected, and now your business space needs to work harder for you. Jeff Grandfield knows how healthcare providers and business owners can make the best of the leasing solutions and your physical business space. Jeff Grandfield, the lease coach, is my guest expert on Practice Management Nuggets, webinars for your healthcare practice. What to consider before sub-leasing. My name is Jean Eaton, your practice management mentor with Information Managers, and your host for this Practice Management Nuggets webinar. In this 30-minute webinar, Jeff Grandfield will discuss the options for healthcare providers and business owners to consider after they have opened their first location and now need to right-size their business space. Jeff Grandfield is a senior consultant with the Lease Coach. Jeff completed his honors BA degree in business administration with designation in marketing from Wilfrid Laurier University. It was the challenge of the real estate industry and satisfaction of working with business owners of all types and sizes that drove Jeff to pursue a career in real estate and join the Lease Coach in 2005. Welcome to Practice Management Nuggets, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Jean.
It's great to have you back. We've met before, and in fact, you were a guest on Practice Management Nuggets in 2014, and you gave some great tips on leasing do's and don'ts when you're looking for your commercial space and for renegotiating your lease. I'm very happy to have you back to help us with those situations when the leasing space that we thought we had that was great maybe it hasn't worked out quite the way that it has. And I'm really interested to hear about your tips to help healthcare providers work through this uncomfortable place and get to the right size for their clinic location. Jeff, what types of situations do you see in your practice where business owners need to reconsider their space requirements?
Over the years, I've seen a lot of different scenarios where a tenant needs to adjust their size. In some cases, it's growing. In some cases, it's right-sizing, reconfiguring, downsizing. And this can happen for a number of reasons, whether it's not getting the right number of partners in initially, departure of a partner or a key person in the business, changes in the economy, health reasons, or simply not negotiating the right size of space or doing a deal on the right size right from the get-go.
So we're going to get into some of those options and some solutions if this is a situation that you find yourself in. But Jeff, first of all, I want to ask you about the elephant in the room. So every practice has a pink elephant. It's a problem in your organization that just never quite gets fixed, or you've created workarounds or promise that you'll get to it someday, or it's that problem that everyone knows is there and everyone tries to ignore it. Jeff, what is your number one tip? What should healthcare business owners know about subleasing?
I think the number one tip for healthcare business owners is really understanding what their options or rights are when it comes to subleasing the space and having effective communication with the landlord through that process and outlining their expectations.
So oftentimes we see the landlord as being a big, scary beast or an individual that tells us all the things that we can't do, but it's really important to nurture that relationship so that we can have these important discussions.
Absolutely. And that's so accurate in there is people are often intimidated to have those conversations, or they take the approach where they realize they've got to change something in their business and they come to their landlord or the property management and manager and tell them what they're going to do, as opposed to communicating with them and telling them their situation, sharing with them, and asking permission or consent to do something different than what their business was originally structured as when the lease was initially signed.
So it really is the best interest of both parties to have a good communication strategy.
Absolutely. I see situations all the time where business doesn't go well for the tenant, and ultimately that falls back to the landlord, where that practice or business may close or move, and perhaps they didn't have to. If the tenant had approached them in the right way and openly and conveyed what the challenges they have, what options they're looking at, not only can that help save the tenant business or save them money, but also allow them to be a good long-term rent-paying tenant for that landlord.
when we first get started with the business, we look at our crystal ball and we try and do some business forecasting, and we find what we hope is going to be that perfect location. So in the beginning, we are hoping that we've got the right choice. And if it's your first practice in particular, there are so many decisions to make. So it's really not surprising that perhaps the decisions that you made at the beginning don't always turn out to be the way that reality brings to us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's challenging, especially as you noted, if it's your first business or practice that you're opening. If you're not getting all the information, and that's a hard thing to do, to make effective decisions, you may end up leasing the wrong location, the wrong size location, under the wrong terms, and ultimately you're usually committing to 5 or 10 year lease agreements, and a lot can change in 5 or 10 years. Even if you did it right the first time with gathering as much information as you can and have a little bit of luck on your side and you think you did everything right, things change, whether, as I noted earlier, whether it's personal situations, health situations, economic situations. Some of the best laid plans need adjustment over time.
Right. That's a good point about your change in partners. That is very frequent in businesses that are just getting started. There's a lot of changes, and there's a lot of changes in staff and partners. So that's a really frequent opportunity, or a frequent circumstance. And sometimes just the location. You've got a new construction project in place. So maybe you had a great location, but now it's tied up in 3 years of LRT construction.
Absolutely. Outside things can impact your practice, and it may be short-term temporary pain through construction, LRT construction, which can be a little bit more than short-term, but you also get into a situation where certain plazas, certain areas, certain centers may change their demographic, people's shopping patterns, how many people go to that center. That can change over time, and that can be both positive in some cases, but detrimental to the growth and continued success of your practice. And sometimes that's going to change what you need to do in your practice, whether it's downsizing or relocating or making other adjustments.
So for a healthcare owner that is feeling the pain of any of these things that we've talked about, what is their next step? How do we get past the pain and back onto the sunny side of the street?
I think the first thing is sitting down and evaluating what their situation is and looking at some of the possible outcomes. If they're in a situation where they have too much space, they are not fully utilizing it, that's where we look into that subleasing opportunity and looking at it and saying, are there other healthcare professionals, complementary businesses, tenants that could come in and use some of the space and offset some of the overhead costs that that tenant may be carrying at their location. Now, that said, once you determine that maybe you need to sublease the space and evaluate who you could sublease it out to, you really have to come back to that initial tip where you have to understand what rights you have and how that's going to impact the potential tenants that you're bringing in to share your space, what consent you need from the landlord, and what items you need to go through to ensure that's going to be a good fit.
So my recollection of lease agreements is that it's a lot of words on a lot of pages. What should we pay attention to, Jeff?
Well, I think the first thing you've got to look at is the procedure that you need to go through. How do you approach the landlord? What consent do you need? What information do you have to provide to them? What's the process? And that can be effectively communicated by talking to the property manager or the landlord and sharing that you're looking to sublease space, and how do we go about doing that? Because what you're really looking at is that if, for example, you're bringing in another healthcare provider that's not the same service that you're providing in there, is that even permitted within your lease agreement? Is that infringing on another tenant's exclusive rights within the center? Will the landlord permit that? So looking at what is the type of user that you're looking to bring in and share the space or sublease the space? Is that going to be compatible with your lease and with the center? Looking at, is there information that's needed by that party for the landlord's approval? Looking at, if it's another business coming in that is going to be different, they may be looking for exposure. So do you have the ability to put other signage on your space, on the pylon signs of the property? All of those little things that are going to be important to that new tenant coming in, you have to make sure that that's not going to conflict with your lease or the landlord's expectation for the shopping center.
Okay. So we've got a lot of things to consider, and I've learned about signage. It's become such a big issue. So that's certainly something that I learned from our first interview with you, Jeff. So when we've got an idea that we want to bring somebody in for a sub-leasing situation, how do we prepare for that meeting with the manager? What are your tips that we should consider?
Well, I think the first thing is going in prepared is what you said. How do you prepare for it? And that's bringing the information to the landlord or to the property manager on who the party is that's coming in, the type of business they're going to operate, what their expectations are. And the landlord's ultimately going to dictate through that meeting or request in writing that you outline what the terms and conditions you're expecting. And this is the critical part to making sure that everything works for both you and the landlord and the other tenant, is that if there's expectations on new signage for the property, I've had cases where healthcare tenants have wanted to put in another business within. In this case, it was, if I recall, they were putting in a subtenant of an aesthetic laser clinic into the space. And their expectation was and this was a long-term sublease, that they were coming in and we're going to put them in there. But their expectation was that they could just slap up another sign on the front of the building that would have that tenant signage on there. But little did they know is that they were going to require the landlord's consent and permission and have to follow their guidelines on where it can go, the size it'll go, the style of letters. Everything that they had to go through when they initially signed the lease agreement, they had to make sure that was going to work for the landlord. So by making sure you have that information on who the tenant is, their type of use, their signage, their expectations, if there's parking requirements for other staff or for other patients, depending on the type of property, all of that should be outlined in writing, presented to the landlord for their review so that they can ultimately approve the sublease and potentially make any amendments to the existing lease to make sure those rights are accounted for and those expectations are met.
Okay. So, Jeff, there's a variety of different options that a business owner could use about subleasing, and it might be as small as having another healthcare provider or a complementary provider using the space on the evenings and weekends. So they don't have a big footprint. Do we still need to go through all those steps, even if we've got somebody who's just making use of a spare office?
You really should. I mean, a lease is always going to indicate that if you're ever, and when I say always, the vast majority of the time, a lease is going to indicate that if you're doing anything where somebody's using your space and is subleasing the space, you're charging for it, it's going to require the landlord's consent. And this is for a couple of reasons. They just want to know what's going on in their building, who the tenants are, who's using the space, make sure that proper insurance is in place, there's no conflicting uses. You really should go through those processes. Even if it's straightforward, it may be a fairly straightforward process with the landlord too. You may come to them and say, look, we're subleasing out these 3 offices on these days, these times, and the landlord may simply approve it very quickly. You know, it may be a very short process with a very short sublease agreement, but you noted that maybe it's somebody, if you've got a smaller space, they're not sharing the space at the same time, but they're using it in the hours you're not. You know, maybe it's evenings, maybe it's weekends. Again, depending on the type of building you're in, if you're in a retail strip center, generally speaking, you've got your own exterior access and that'll be no issue. But if you're in a professional building or office building, there may be restricted hours where the main doors are locked, and you want to make sure that before you get into an agreement with your subtenant that those building hours are not going to be an issue. So there may be some amendments that you have to make or arrangements to make sure that the building is open for the hours that are going to be needed for the subtenant, and that you're permitted to use your space for the public during those hours.
Okay. So even if you're looking at maximizing your underutilized space in that clinic, we still need to review the information on the lease and get the blessing or the modification from the landlord to allow that to happen.
Yeah, and I would highly encourage that, even if it seems like such a simple process and so little that needs to be done. if your lease says that you require that consent, I generally would go through that. I mean, I see a lot of tenants, and I'm sure there's a lot of business owners out there that are subleasing their space that is not done through the proper channels and proper protocol. But if you're getting into agreement where you potentially are opening yourself up to exposure of breaking an agreement by a contract of a sublease to another tenant where they're investing money or time or advertising, and all of a sudden a landlord becomes aware of that subtenant and puts you in default of the lease, and you're required to rectify it by booting out that tenant, it could cause other problems for you. So if there's a lot of potential moving parts or things that can be at risk, I think you really should take the steps to go through the motions. And it may be a very quick process. In some cases, it's long and complicated and a lot of moving parts. In other cases, it may be something that you can get the landlord's consent very quickly with very minimal paperwork.
Okay. So that's a good item about the risks if you don't go through the right channels, is that you could actually be considered default in your lease, and you could lose your business space entirely. Is that right?
It's possible. Well, I'd say it's unlikely that you're going to jeopardize your lease being terminated, but you do open yourself up to, penalties, to putting yourself in a default position that if you don't rectify it within your cure period, depending on what your lease says, that if you do something that constitutes a default, every lease is going to be different on what the landlord's rights and ramifications and remedies are. And in most cases, I'd be surprised that it would put you in a position where you're going to completely risk losing the space for your business. But some leases are written very heavy-handed for the landlord, and by doing something that is putting you in a default position could really hurt you financially.
Okay. What about those situations where you've got a subtenant who wants to come in and they want two of these offices, so you're going to knock down the adjoining wall? What do we have to talk about with the landlord about those types of situations where we're going to do some minor renovations?
That's a really good question. And as we continue through this, you can see there's so much that you've got to look at depending on what you're going to do. And before I jump into this point, I want to touch on one last thing on the default, a follow-up point on the default scenario. If you default on your lease or put yourself in a default position, you may be subject to financial penalties or the landlord taking action, but you also may put yourself in risk for not immediate ramifications, but some leases will be written that if you default on the lease, the landlord may not terminate you immediately or take action in that regard, but some leases are written that if you default, you can lose rights. So maybe it's an exclusive right that no other medical professionals of the same field can come into your center. You may lose future rights of renewal options. So there's a lot of things that can come into play if you default on your lease, and that's where you want to be very careful that you're communicating and follow the rules of the lease. Okay,
good point. Thank you.
So to that point on your question, go ahead, Jean, ask the question if you'd like. Again, I know I sidetracked there a little bit.
That's okay. So if we find that we want to do some renovations to accommodate a new subtenant, maybe take down a wall between two adjoining offices so they've got a bigger space, what do we need to consider?
This comes back to reviewing your lease and understanding your rights in there. Now, if you're doing some leases will be structured that if you're doing what are considered cosmetic improvements, and that will be defined in your lease agreement, that you may not need the landlord consent. If the landlord has approved that subtenant and you're proceeding with it, you may not need landlord consent to make changes to the space. But most leases are written that if you're doing anything beyond cosmetic of maybe painting or changing the flooring where you're starting to impact plumbing or electrical or anything that may tie into structural stuff, that the landlord's going to want to see the plans and provide their approval. So again, if you're erring on the side of caution and you're making renovations, that's where you should be communicating with your landlord or property manager saying, as part of the sublease, we plan to do this, this, or this. What consents do we need? Do we need it in writing? And if you do, going through those motions to ensure that what you're planning to do is approved by the landlord.
All right. So when in doubt, talk with the landlord and make sure that we're all on the same same playing field and that we can move forward together.
Correct. I think that's the biggest thing, and why I said the number one tip is effective communication. This is where things go sideways, is when a landlord feels like a tenant's doing something to their property that they're not aware of or haven't consented to. And it leads to all kinds of disputes and arguments and things where it could have been a very smooth process. The landlord starts rejecting it or resisting it purely because they didn't like the way you handled it initially.
Okay. Jeff, you mentioned something to me when we were talking previously, those type of situations where perhaps the business owner just comes to the decision that this is not the right location and they need to move their business somewhere else. What types of options could they look at?
That's a good question, and that's a tough decision to come to as a business owner. And depending on where you are in the lease term, how long your business is there might be a lot of different options open to you. And sometimes a business owner really has to look at this and say, is this the right location to continue to struggle in? If you're not in the right location, not in the right size, and you haven't just opened up a year ago and spent a substantial amount renovating, you might be looking at this and saying, can I relocate? And you may look at this and say, how much time do I have left on the lease? Now, if your lease is ending in the near future, and I say under, a year, 18 months, you may simply look at it and say, well, I don't need to get out of my lease early, because it takes time to relocate, to find a location, to negotiate the lease, go through a new construction process. And that can be timely and it can appear to be costly. But in the long run, if you're getting into the new right building for you or the right size, you may simply need to plan to leave at the end of your term. Now, if you've got too much time left on your lease where you can't wait it out and you're losing money and you can't find the right sublease situation, you can't subsidize your costs, you do have a few options in there. You can look to purely sublease the entire space to another healthcare provider, to another use completely different, and effectively get out of your lease agreement early. A slight adjustment to that is a different direction you can go is what's called a lease assignment, where you're not subleasing it, and typically in a sublease, you're collecting rent for part of the space or the whole space, and then you're passing it on to the landlord, is what's called a lease assignment. This is where you're transferring your rights to the lease. So again, if this turns out to be not the right situation for you and you've got time or term left on your lease, you may turn around and say, I've got to find somebody else. And again, it may be a different healthcare provider. It may be, if you're in a retail center, it may be a restaurant that's seeking space in your fully leased out property. You can look to assign the lease, and that's a process that, just like subleasing, you have to look at your lease, you have to look at your rights and understand what process, what procedure, what rights, what obligations, how that's all going to unfold, and how to effectively do that with the landlord.
Okay.
There's a couple other points that I'll add to that as well, Jean. If you're not looking at subleasing, you can look at, in some cases, even if you have term left on your lease, a landlord may realize you're struggling and say, well, gee, if 3,000 or 4,000 or 5,000 square feet is not working for you, but your business would be much better suited in, 2/3 of the space or half the space, and they have another opening, even if you have 2, 3, 4 years left on their term, they may be prepared to relocate you to another unit if they have demand for that larger space, or if they realize that by moving you and right-sizing you and maybe extending your term is going to ensure you're a long-term tenant. That's an opportunity that you want to look at and consider and discuss with your landlord, as is simply carving off part of your space. If you've got 4,000 square feet and you need 3,000, it may cost you some money to reconfigure and adjust your practice size, but knocking off a quarter of your overhead in there could be the difference between being successful long-term and not. And the landlord, if the neighboring tenant needs that space, or they've got a vacancy, or they can turn that into a usable space, again, they may be very open to considering that if it helps establish you as a long-term tenant for them.
Jeff, you're making me feel more comfortable about this all the time.
Well, good. I'm glad that is. And yeah, and that's the goal, is what I try to realize to people is that I've been doing this a long time, and whether it's negotiating a new lease, whether it's a renewal, whether it's dealing with an issue in the middle of the lease agreement, a lot of this comes down to creative thinking and communication and understanding what the alternatives are, because in a lot of cases, there are alternatives. It just depends on how you're approaching that and what works for you.
Okay. Jeff, there's a lot of details in here that you've shared with us. But if I were to have an office space that I needed to right size, I would be lost as to what to do next. So how can you help us? What should somebody do to get some help to make these decisions?
Well, that's a really good point you make, is that I could probably spend hours talking to you about all the different scenarios, what you need to consider, what you need to look at, and we still probably wouldn't cover everything, especially because some of these situations are going to be unique to that tenant, that building, their size, their use. It's going to be a unique situation for almost every tenant. There's going to be some general options and solutions, but I think the best thing that you can do for any healthcare business owners listening to this is that if you've got any questions on your unique situation, you can contact my office. You can contact me by email. I'm more than happy to provide a no-charge 30-minute consultation to any business owners that want to discuss their situation with me.
That's fantastic. So how should they reach you, Jeff?
There's a few ways they can do that. They can start with our website, which will have my email amongst all of our staff's emails on there, our phone numbers. Our website is www.theleasecoach.com, which is THELEASECOACH.com. They can call our number at our mainline number at 780-448-2645. I'm at extension 3, but any of our staff can certainly point you in the right direction. Or if any of the listeners want to email me directly, my email is jeffgrandfield@theleasecoach.com, which is JEFFGRANDFIELD @theleasecoach.com.
Okay. And we'll have the links on the webinar and on the show notes if you're listening to us on Practice Management Nuggets podcasts on Stitcher and on iTunes. Jeff, this has been really helpful. You have made things so much calmer for me to think about having clients that need to right-size their space. So I appreciate all the suggestions that you have. And the number one tip about making sure that you're keeping your lines of communication open with your property management, with your landlord, in the good times and in the not so good times, so that you don't have the high anxiety and you can find a solution that works best for your business. Jeff, is there anything else that you think that we might have missed or you'd like to go back to or you want to add?
No, I think you really summed it up good there in your last point, is keeping communication open in the good times or the bad. If you ever need to ask for a favor, being able to make a withdrawal on that relationship is going to be a lot easier if you've made deposits into that relationship over time. So getting to know your landlord, your property manager, having a good relationship with them from the start throughout the term, having that communication will make a world of difference if you ever need to request a favor. And in some cases, it really does come down to that. It comes down to requesting a favor to help you through any bumps in the road or hurdles that your business may be facing.
Okay, that's a good point. We tend to communicate better with people that we can see the whites of their eyes every now and again. And if we can keep on in contact with each other and on that friends list, it makes things a little easier when the road gets bumpy.
Absolutely. And that can be little things like in the healthcare field is when you opened up initially, inviting them to any grand opening, inviting them to take a tour of your space, sharing information about your business, just keeping that communication, keeping that relationship going so that you do have a relationship to draw on. Okay.
Great tips as always, Jeff. I'm so thankful that you have helped us out today. And I want to encourage the audience to take up Jeff on his offer for a 30-minute free consultation. The links are in your show notes. And thank you, Jeff, for joining us for Practice Management Nuggets.
Thank you very much for having me on the Practice Nuggets. I really appreciate it.
I love surrounding myself with practice managers and healthcare providers who want to start, grow, and improve their practices. I want to help you with more great tips, tools, templates, and training that you can use right away. Members of Practice Management Nuggets will receive a link after our webinar today with a link to contact Jeff Grandfield for all of your commercial lease questions. They will also be on the show notes for our podcast on Stitcher and on iTunes. I search for guest experts who will share their number one tip with you. Let me know if there is a topic or a guest expert that you want to hear on Practice Management Nuggets, webinars for your healthcare practice. Until next time, I'm Jean Eaton, your practice management mentor with Information Managers.